Okay, cool. So there is a lot of anxiety right now with the killing of Charlie Kirk. People are on edge. And so there's a lot of rhetoric that divides us across a wide range of issues. It feels like we're growing further and further apart from a common understanding of what's going on in the world and what should happen. And so what I was thinking we would do is use today's session to talk about what happens inside us when sides are taken. And so I was thinking we could talk about maybe we'll unpack how our egos create division, discuss why conflict feels so personal, and then maybe provide some tips on how to shift out of this survival mode and then experience like a deeper connection to others, even when we disagree or even when people trigger us. So I want to have a conversation about inner transformation, how we understand ourselves better, how stress affects how we interact with others, that sort of thing. How's that sound to you? Is that okay?
Yes, and I just wanted to say, as usual, one, we're going to take this from the point of view of the meditation and spiritual principles that we talk about on this website that's in the book and this coaching practice. And so we're going to take it from that point of view. Two, we invite any kind of comments or questions on topic. But three, because this topic is so sensitive, what we're trying to do here is build a common understanding and even a sense of shared community here. And so if I interpret or we interpret that, you're just here to argue, or I mean, healthy asking and needing clarity and bringing up a point of view is one thing. Showing that you're not interested in building a community is another. And I think at this time in our world, we need that to start building communities as a global people as soon as possible. And so we won't be responding to anything that we sense is like you're just there to put somebody down. Yeah. So we understand this is a very sensitive topic, and we promise that this is not about taking sides. This is talking about more about, yeah, what's been already said. What happens to people when they go into these kinds of separate tribes, and how does that actually happen? So you can go ahead.
Okay, so let's start with that because I think a good place to begin is how humans evolved. In early man, the whole point was to survive, get food, get shelter, stay warm, etc. And the best way to survive was to cooperate with other humans, to form groups of people or tribes, for mutual protection, for hunting, that sort of thing. And so a lot of our genes are the result of many, many, eons of evolution where humans who exhibited those traits and practiced those things evolved to survive. They passed their genes on. And in the past, that would have been keeping together with your like-minded tribe and perceiving the environment as a threat, animals, weather, whatever it might be. But in modern society, we don't have as much of those threats from the weather or, in the environment. The threats that we perceive come from other people. But our the bodies have evolved to perceive those threats and respond in certain ways. So I thought maybe you could talk about that, the way that humans have evolved for protection and the survival instinct, and how the stimulation of the past or the environment might be different than the kind of stimuli or environmental factors that we get today. And yet our bodies have not evolved in the modern world. They evolved in a different time. So maybe talk about a little bit on that and anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, I want to start out with what what I feel at Light Minds we need to get back to. So first is understanding that our greatest strength as a species, human beings, is our ability to survive under any conditions. However, that is also our greatest weakness because what we're experiencing right now is a result of that survival mechanism needing to be on in a heightened state for hundreds of generations. And to just understand how it works, this survival mechanism of as it gets passed down to generations, because we're big on the generational trauma thing here. So that's one. And then the two other thing is, we just need to be more sensitive to that. We need to be more sensitive to each other, the way we talk to people. Even and it has to start at home, in our own families, with our own mothers, brothers, children. I mean, how many times do we hear in our own family they are not being sensitive to your feelings and stuff? So, yeah, so we just need to understand how the human mechanism works, especially over several generations with the survival mechanism, and therefore be sensitive to that and therefore each other.
Yeah. Maybe in that context, we oftentimes think of we should or oftentimes do think of our family as our safe space, our tribe, the people who should support us unconditionally, whereas other people are the dangerous people, the threats. And so that makes it very difficult when you can't turn to your family members for safety, or in fact, you feel that your family member is somehow threatening or dangerous to you. So that doesn't leave you a strong foundation of security upon which to build.
No. And so you can have whole neighborhoods of families not feeling safe with each other, of uh, even the same ethnic and cultural community where the individual family units are not feeling safe and comfortable with each other. And again, it comes down to understanding, in my opinion, the whole generational trauma piece. So the way it works is, you know, you put a child before reproductive age through a trauma, meaning they get scared and jittery, anxious, maybe even think they're going to die, or they're just feeling, such an intense emotion over something, and it's not resolved. They push it down, and then when that child becomes reproductive age, it affects their genetic material. It's called epigenetics, and so it affects the genes that you create, and then you end up creating, or you're at more risk for having a child when you grow up that has uh, features that have emotional dysregulation at its core, like Asperger's, autism, ADHD, bipolar, schizophrenia, PTSD. These are all mental health diagnoses that have emotional dysregulation as a feature. And when a child goes through a trauma, they're much more at risk for having a child like that. And then it gets passed down generation to generation to generation, and then it builds up. And so now we are, in my opinion, a species that has gotten so used to modern stress. Yeah, we'll complain about it and all, but we don't have any solutions to get out of it. And the solution, in my opinion, is you have to prioritize it. You have to prioritize being sensitive to the way human beings are, starting with your own family.
And then for people who do not feel that security, who don't have that, then they're more easily triggered when something happens, or when it could be not even just them directly, it could just be in the news or current events, things that occur, but underscore this feeling of lack of security, lack of that stable foundation. The world's falling apart, the world's in conflict, um, us versus them, people are out to get you, sort of a feeling,
Yeah, you will
right?
naturally have that. You'll naturally have that over generations as a result of. So, as I'm saying this, this is not, on the one hand, this is not a mistake that this is happening, because human biology is just showing you this is what happens when you trigger the survival mechanism too much in a species over time, over several generations. Somebody wrote here, autism is a protective gene to protect consciousness from distortion. We resist naturally. Okay, so they're going spiritual, which is what I had to do. So, because my suffering was really great because of the generational trauma and stuff. And we will talk about that later, because they wrote here, understanding self and consciousness. Yes, I mean that is a way to look at it. But practically, not everybody can do that, or really, I mean, practically that I don't know if that is a quote unquote solution that everyone can do to the point where it's a difficult one to awaken, basically. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit.
Yeah.
So let's, so we were just talking about how early humans, we needed to separate ourselves and our tribe from others to survive, but today it's a very different environment, and yet our brains, you know, we've evolved in that same way. And so social media, for example, creates I, groups or identities, validates that point of view, feeds you content that reinforces your point of view, and it does serve their business model to have people get worked up about things, to create conflict, to create engagement where you're arguing with other people. And so there's a little bit of I would say a dopamine hit when you bond with others who are like-minded, attack others who disagree with you, then feel that you are righteous in your point of view, and you feel a camaraderie, a common bond with like-minded people, but you are creating divisions and conflicts with other people. Do you want to maybe say about that? We talked about this previously, but maybe say a few words
You
about social
can, well,
media.
put it this way. I mean, the fact that all of this works, that divisions can be enforced and companies, social media, people can take advantage of that, or that can be taken advantage of, to me, is still a sign that like that our human species is under enough duress that all of that works. So once you understand that the way human biology works is you put a whole species under a constant duress like that, it's going to create situations in which it's very easy to turn to tribalism. It's very easy to turn to the survival mechanism. From there, once that's already happened, and it has, everything of how all of this gets enforced makes sense because you have a whole species now operating under this kind of duress. And so all the ways that it can be taken advantage of and works makes sense. So even within a tribe itself, there is factions. I'll just use my people as an example of this. Like, I'm Filipino, full bred. We're not a big part of the population, but you go to the islands there, sometimes they'll start separating each other out according to the different kind of provinces. Oh, you're Lucano. I heard all Lucano Filipinos are drunks. Like we're all Filipino here. So even in a population that small, you'll start to have factions within factions within factions. And again, it has to start with the family. How many times do we criticize members of our own family?
Yeah. It strikes me as a little bit perverse that social media will profit by creating anxiety within its quote unquote customers. If you're using social media and you get worked up, you're anxious, and you watch more videos and you engage, that makes them more money. And yet it's not doing any good for you to get worked up about things. In some ways, it feels good in the moment, but ultimately, for your mental health and for your overall happiness, it's probably negative. It's probably not helping you.
Well,
And
I agree. I agree. And again, to me, it's just a sign that our modern surviving in our modern economic society, which is a global thing. I mean, like, there's not a lot of groups of people that survive as a community off the grid outside of the economic society. So that has become surviving in our economic based global society has become such a priority that how many times do you hear, well, it's a living. I have to make a living somehow. So I do it through social media. So I do it through this, that, or the other. So, like, everybody has to make a living. If I don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. See how much we prioritized this now over being sensitive to ourselves as a species.
yeah. We have this self-conception of who we are. And so I think this is part of the real issue is it's a mental construct. It's how we self-identify, and we create those divisions because we identify with certain groups. And really that's an illusion in the sense that we're all part of one thing. So if we wanted to get into non-dualism, we're all made up of the same universal energy. We're all part of one continuous thing. We
Yes.
just have this mental image that we are separate, that, I'm a liberal, you're a conservative, or whatever the issue might be.
This is great. I'm sorry. Somebody said this to me once. I don't know if they're talking about you or me. I love you in Squid Game. Somebody said that to me once. My daughter thinks that you look like the guy in Squid Game. I never saw the show. I'm like, then I saw him like, oh gosh, I do. Anyway, thanks.
Yeah.
Getting back to this whole thing. Sorry, the ADHD. See, I'm a result of the generational trauma. What?
Yeah.
Just give me the
And
question one more time.
not non-dualism. So everything is an illusion. We create a mental construct of
Okay,
who
that
we
that was it.
are, our
Okay,
identity.
got it. So understand that this is all universal energy, universal expression appearing as a person. But as it appears as a person, the person is a biological mechanism. You trigger a trauma in that biological mechanism, like watching violence or having violence done to you in some kind of way. Something where, you know, it gets triggered as much as we create our identities will be influenced and formed based on those kinds of trauma-like triggers. And what they say now is in psychology and psychiatry that by the time you're 10 years old, the great majority of your personality is already set. You're already the person that you're going to be by the time you're like 10, 11 years old, which does sort of follow suit because when I coach people and parents especially, they'll say, like, by the time my daughter was like 11 or 12 years old or 11 years old, they were telling me that, to back off. They were telling me they wanted to be their own person. They just, they started to rebel against me. Yeah, because the person's already formed by that time. And what informs the creation of that person, these identities you're talking about, is if that body goes through trauma, that will definitely influence the kind of identity that is created.
Yeah. And so because we create that identity of who we are in our group, in our tribe, then it does lead to these conflicts with other groups, other individuals who are not part of that identity, that we don't identify with them. We can create them a separate category. It's us versus them, me versus you. And maybe you can speak to non-dualism and how that is really sort of an illusion of how we're different from others, that we really are just all in it together.
Yeah, so to me, I mean, I wanted to address this that the spiritual aspect of it because the person is bringing up a point here, and I have it in the back of my mind. The only thing that is subjective is awareness. So, uh, there's different ways to put this, like Buddhism, non-duality, spirituality, stuff like that. But so everything is universal energy appearing as this. In radical forms of understanding this and knowing this in a deeper level, there are no individuals. There are no individuals making individual separate decisions. And there are meditations in this account that can actually point to that, free will is an illusion, not because it doesn't exist. It's because there's a belief in an individual who has it, and that's a myth. So the point is, then if there's no individuals making separate free will type decisions, this is all a movie that's just playing on its own. And spiritual teachers who have been quote unquote enlightened and had their ego death or egos dropped out have been saying that for centuries. That when the ego dropped out, it was seen everything is appearing and operating on their own. There are no individuals there, right? And so, in that respect, if all of this is a movie, it's like watching a movie with a dramatic problem like Casablanca and saying, "Oh my goodness, that's a problem." Everything that's happening in the movie there, those people taking over Casablanca, causing this couple to da 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 da. That's terrible. No, it's not. Why? It's a movie. It's because it's not real. It's part of the movie, right? However, to use that as a philosophy for living, I've found problems with it. That you can't just keep saying, "Well, it's all just a movie anyway." It's just taken to its nth degree like that. People have used that like it's all meaningless because it's a movie. Have used that in the story to kill themselves. It's all meaningless anyway. Doesn't make a difference. So, in my opinion, like trying to use that, I mean, it's yes, ultimately, this is God's world, God's universe. This is the universe of universal energy because there's no individuals. But to try using that as a practical philosophy for living, from my experience, you have problems with it. So I just want to put that out there. First of all,
Yeah, maybe it's worth explaining because maybe I don't think everyone is so familiar with the ideas of non-dualism. And so maybe we can take a step back and explain that a little bit more and then sort
yeah,
of,
and I invite this person who's seeing, I have some wisdom that makes you get you thinking. If you want to share something, that's perfectly fine. To me, you're on point. So um, you want me to explain that? So I mean, it's been called many things: non-duality, spirituality. Religions are based on it. Basically, when the ego dissolves, drops out, or is seen as the illusion, and so quote unquote individuals this has happened to have been saying for centuries, everything is oneness. Everything is this one thing. Everything is operating on its own. There are no separate individuals. Even more so than that, everything is emptiness. Everything is not as solid or real as you realize, as the brain might think and stuff. So that's what, taken in a non-religious way, it's been called non-duality. And there are a lot of YouTube videos on that
yeah.
around
So
that you can find.
the way I think about it is that normally we see the world kind of like there's me, there's you, there's inside, there's outside, good and bad. We separate in our minds these different things, but really it's just one reality. So this illusion of reality comes from our brains, and we filter what's going on in the world. We create labels and stories, and we categorize different things. And that was useful for survival because you wanted to make sure that, the person continued living. But it's really a very small portion of what's actually happening. It's just a thin, like filtered view of what's going on. And so really reality is much more interconnected. There is not a separate you versus, them. We're all in it together. So everything is connected. So that's how I think of non-dualism.
Okay, yeah, that's a way to put it.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, and so then in the context of when something happens in the news or people have conflict, it's going back to that survival instinct of us versus them. I'm part of my tribe, you are separate and, other. And therefore, that creates conflict because there's an illusion that we are separate from each other. In reality, we're all interconnected, we're all part of the world. And so if we understood that, we might still have these emotions and these feelings, but the way we would respond to them, the way we would interact and process those emotions would be different because we have this understanding we're all part of one thing.
And I would say to understand that on a deeper scientific level and to understand that beyond an intellectual level. Because you try to understand that on an intellectual level, yes, I understand that we're all one, but there are people out there who are doing terrorist attacks trying to kill Americans, or there's, other people out there that are just dangerous. So I understand that and all, but there are bad people out there, and so it has to go beyond, in my opinion, an intellectual thing in order to understand. You have to go to a more experiential, like the oneness has to be actually felt beyond intellect, known, not just felt, known beyond intellect. And the other thing is to take our understanding of how all of this universe and ourselves work and the reality of it on a much deeper level that quantum physics, I think it is pointing to that when they tried to study the nature of energy, they found that energy will become whatever the scientist was looking for. You've heard that? That so if the scientist was looking for energy in waves and the calibration, it became waves. When the scientist was looking for energy as particles, it became particles. And they realized energy was changing itself based on what the scientist was looking for. So if you're looking for bad people doing bad things, and there are a lot of evil people out there, and you're looking for it, or it's not my fault, I've been traumatized, and I'm an edgy person. You'll start finding it. Actually, more than that, you'll start creating it and stuff.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that on that kind of deeper level that we're doing it to ourselves.
Yeah. That's the dual nature of particles and waves for the scientists out in the audience. It's like things exist as both particles and waves simultaneously, but it's when you observe them that it collapses down to one of them, that you can identify, oh, that's a particle. Um, yeah. But kind of getting back to this mental construct of reality, people have egos. Our ego has evolved for survival. And we have emotions. Emotions also have evolved to protect us. Fear, anger. Those are those emotions have evolved to drive action, as you've talked about previously. It's a way of trying to spur the body to do something. It's not good or bad. It just is. Your emotions just are. That's what it is. And so the fact that we have these feelings, okay, it's a feeling, it's an emotion. That's just the way, the body is responding to the stimuli, to the environment or whatever. And so I think this is a little bit of understanding that, and then maybe there's a deeper emotion sometimes. In this case, we're talking about survival, a threat to the tribe, a threat to you as an individual. But it could also be other issues of not feeling respected, or maybe there's some other issues that are deep inside that is what's causing this reaction, this
Yeah.
outward visible reaction.
So yeah, so I would say more than even being aware, to be sensitive to it and to prioritize it. I want to also I also want to address this. Somebody's asking to come on the talk, and I just want to address. I apologize. This is meant to be like a podcast interview type thing. We'd be totally willing. I'd be totally willing to consider having this be a little more like a panel discussion, but this wasn't intended in the creation of this. So if you want to DM me, we can discuss it. I'd be willing to consider it. But this podcast interview thing was meant to be like a two-person thing. I'd be willing to consider things like panels and discussions and stuff like that, but we just weren't prepared for it. So I apologize that I'm not going to address that at this time. So I think that we need to be more than just aware and sensitive to it. So I'll use myself as an example because this is a perfect example. Generational trauma passing down gets into me. And as a result of that, my brain becomes hypersensitive. I'm born with a brain that's hypersensitive. Now with the diagnosis of ADHD, autism, PTSD, and stuff. And as a result of that, my personality is just a very hypersensitive, very emotional personality. I ended up marrying somebody who's similar, in my opinion. Because I could see from their grandfather to their father to them generational trauma and honestly the undiagnosed mental health things that were happening in that person. And initially in our marriage, we're now divorced. Initially now in our marriage, we were very sensitive to each other. I felt for the first several years. I was emotional, she was emotional, but we were very sensitive and loving to each other. We took the time to be sensitive to our feelings. But modern living, you have to get a full-time job, got a kid, bought a house. The priorities that, no, when you grow up as an adult, you're trained to prioritize functioning independently in our economic-based society, especially when you have a kid and a house and a marriage, insurance, stuff like that. No one really, you don't really taught as a kid that when you're an adult, you are to prioritize understanding yourself as a human species and being sensitive to the way biologically we work generationally. And so as a result of that, over time, we became less sensitive to each other. We began more about like the conversations began to be very transactional. Did you pick this up? Get this? How much money do we have in savings? Da 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 da. It became very about survival, really, and became less and less sensitive. And as a result of that, it was very easy to tick each other off. Now, again, this stuff needs to occur on a family level, not just with your neighbor. It has to start inside and it has to start with you. As a result of this, we broke apart. 25-year marriage. That was the most important relationship in my life that I still love. Even to this day, when I think about it, like I still love that family that I had. Still love them. Like broke apart, not what I wanted. as a result of not being not just aware, but sensitive to it and not prioritizing it enough. And that's where I am right now. And I'll talk a little bit later about when it broke apart, what happened when I did prioritize it. When it broke apart, I did prioritize it. I'll tell you about that later. You can,
Well, why don't we just talk about it since you're on it now? You want to go through the story?
okay. So when it happened, I could have easily so what happened was my wife said she wanted a divorce and I lost my job all in the same weekend, on the same day, on my birthday. So it was a trauma. It was a shock. I was not expecting. I knew that we were having problems. I knew that my job wasn't the best for me, but I was in it, but I was paying for all this. But when I lost it, I wasn't expecting it. So it was a trauma and it was a shock. A lot of times what happens is though, the economic survival aspect of it prioritizes over everything. Makes sense. So people were saying you should get another job. Maybe you should even date somebody, find somebody more compatible, get another girlfriend, something like that. And a lot of people do that. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I wanted to find out what the heck happened because I realized, like, when people said, "Why don't you create another family?" That was the pinnacle of me being able to create a family. Like, what's the use of trying to create something to try to get to that level again if it's going to fall apart again? I want to know what happened to me. Like, what's happening inside me that caused all of this? So I didn't get another girlfriend, didn't start dating, and I also didn't go back into the regular full-time 9 to 5. I do feel lucky in that respect. I had enough to survive on for a while and stuff. So not many people are in that situation, but I made a priority, even to the point where I was saying to myself, if I lose, honestly, a lot of the material possessions and I have to change my life radically to understand myself better, I will do that. So I prioritized it. And that's where all of this came from the last 5 years, the book, coaching protocol, the spiritual understanding everything as awareness, consciousness, everything that this person is saying, this commenter is saying on here, all of that came from the priority of it. Now, when I interact with my ex, now when I interact with my daughter, that's the priority is being sensitive to that. And so do me and my daughter get into arguments and she snaps at me, Dad, like, geez, say please once in a while. Or Dad, got to say thank you once in a while. Because I'm still can be dunderheaded with my, you know, mental health and just not remember and stuff like that. But when that happens now, and there's a potential for an argument there, that was really rude, or something like that. I stop. I think about it. Like I stop, I assess, I think about it. Don't make it worse. It's already bad enough. And she's right. Like, be sensitive to who she is as a person and stuff. And I calm down and I try to address it another way. So, but how long did that take for me to change and do this, change to this? 5 years, you know, but when I say like this is the kind of priority that I think more people need to make, maybe not to that extreme and not that long, but that kind of shift, yeah, I would say so. I mean, look what's happening as a result. Divorce is, what is it? The divorce rate in this country is like 60%. So that's my story. And this is why I can come from this place and talk like this.
And so through your process, you learned more about the nature of reality and non-dualism, and this has helped you address your emotions. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, that the thing that was really causing this person, this ego, to get even more dysregulated was identifying with the person that this body created. This body, this person writes down, I diagnose ASD, bipolar, ADHD, complex PTSD. That's me. That's me. From the generational trauma and the experiences that I had in childhood, I'm autistic. Uh, Mild borderline. Well, that's bipolar. I'm not bipolar, but I was diagnosed mild borderline complex PTSD and stuff. And so where was I going with this? Please help me. Where was I going with this? Do you remember
So
what is?
non-dualism, and
Okay,
you
so what was really killing this ego, though, or making it so heavy and difficult to deal with, is the ego really believed that what the identity of who I really am is exactly the way what was this body and the way it thought, acted, and behaved, and the kind of person that it created. The whole sense of identity and who I thought I was this and what happened to it.
Yeah, let's pause there. So you had this mental image, oh, I am a husband, a father, this family member, I'm an employee at this clinic, et cetera, et cetera. So you had your ego had created an identity for who you were. And when all those things went away, that was that was the shock to the system. That was
Now,
no longer your
well, the
identity.
shock to the system was even on a more basic level was I'm in a fucked up body, and I have overly anxious and all my years of psych meds, therapy, meditation, spiritual retreats, support groups, journaling, all the stuff that I did was this didn't take it away. You know, only the only option I had is maybe to drink myself to oblivion or to get high all the time, which I was doing, multiple addictions as well, and all. But on a deeper level, the shock was the belief that I am this body and it is messed up, and I felt cursed. As a person, I felt cursed because there was so much identity of it. This is what I was. And so non-dual broke free of that. The identity of what I actually was broke free and the illusion was dissolved or seen through is the best way to put it, is seen through because this body's still dysregulated, but it was seen through that. No, that was never your identity. That was never what you really, really are. Yes, this body is still like this, but it's not really what you are. That softened the ego quite a bit to the point where then I could look at my person and my ego and the character that this body created objectively. That's why I talk like this. How many people talk like this? Not many. That's why I can then look at the body and the character that it created objectively. That's why the mental health understanding was also important as well. Because then I could see, oh, so if you do this to a generational trauma line, it's going to create this condition, and this condition is going to have these kinds of symptoms to it, and therefore it's going to affect a relationship this way if you have a brain like that. To be able to look at all that objectively and not take it personally, because every time I try to talk like this to some people take it personally, they'll say something like, yeah, I'm just messed up too. I'm just a messed up person because they'll identify with it too much. And I try to explain, don't take it personally. Like it's not. It's just the way your body was designed. It's not you. And they're like, therefore, having a more fuller understanding of reality, the nature of God and spirituality was necessary for this body to survive. Hope that if you have any questions, go ahead.
Yeah, it's probably worth because I know you've talked about this at some length, on the channel, but it might be worth for people who aren't so familiar with your story, a little bit more about how you came to those realizations, how you came to understand the nature of reality. What is there something that other people could benefit from if they heard what you went through?
Yeah. And this is pretty common. So one, I want to say what I went through is pretty common. You go on YouTube, a lot of spiritual teachers, websites, things like that, people talking about, there's many people that talk like this, and we all have similarities in that we were suffering. There was a lot of mental anguish, existential suffering, right? And therefore, in me and in others, we were trying to resolve it. Maybe we became therapists. I became a drug counselor. I changed my careers, uh, you know, um, and and the suffering became so great that we were looking for answers. And then we came upon, you are not your thoughts. No, this reality is not what your brain thinks it is. It was taken further. So lots of times the suffering can lead you there, but it's not necessary. I know that I know others that there wasn't this kind of suffering involved, but a similar spiritual realization happened there. And so, but
Yeah.
suffering can be the impetus and the driver that can get uh, an identity to shift like that.
Yeah, what I'm struck by is people hearing your story could have compassion for you. You had this family, wife, daughter, job. and in a very short amount of time, you lost it. And I think many people would have compassion for you in that situation. It's much harder, I would say, to have compassion when it's someone else where those circumstances maybe are not as sympathetic. So for example, the person who killed Charlie Kirk, getting back to the beginning of the podcast, what was he going through? What was going on in his life? What was his thought process that led him to that action? He, I presume, was suffering in some way, or felt some deep sort of trauma, or was triggered by something. I'm not excusing it. Obviously it's a heinous act. It has to be condemned. But things don't happen randomly. There was some reason for him to take that action for whatever, he thought in that moment. And if people understood that, if we understood that better, you might understand why someone would be driven to that action. So I think the non-dualist way of looking at, such an event is it's not us versus them. It's not, he's wrong, I'm right. It's not, this tribal thing. It's much more compassion. He and just any individual in that kind of situation has suffered something or they have something going on which causes them to act in a certain way. And if we understood what that root cause was, then we could address that in society. We could prevent those things from happening
Hmm.
by addressing if it's a mental health issue, if it's, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, you could say it's a mental health issue, but in my opinion, it's human genetics. It's how human genetics works. The way the human biology was, it was designed to purge generational trauma by putting unresolved trauma of children in a generational line into one or two people in a lineage. Therefore, they're born with a brain that, as it grows up, becomes dysregulated and too emotional and very emotionally sensitive and defensive. And so, in my opinion, that whole act and the quote unquote person that did it was just the last turn on the jar, of which generationally it was that turn on the jar is being happening for generations. So if you're saying, well, it's still his responsibility to make that choice, you could say that. How old was he? 22? How much at the age of 22 are you the product of the society, culture, family, beliefs, biology that you were born with? You know, I would say that greatly affects the way your brain thinks, the kind of thoughts that come out of it, and the choices that are made up to like what, 80, 90%. And so you're depending now on that like 10% of free will choice to go, well, you need to work against the 90% of the way your brain was raised in the family, what it biologically inherited, and the way society is with all of its separation and people taking advantage of that and
Yeah.
continuing to enforce these tribes and stuff like that. So you're depending upon that person who's possibly born with a dysregulated brain on that 5 to 10% to make the right choice.
Yeah, and not to get too political, but I think to some extent the criminal justice system, it has been developed from neurotypical people who have quote unquote normal lives. They, have jobs, law-abiding citizens, et cetera, et cetera. Doesn't really handle people who don't fall in the distribution in that kind of broad middle. If you're off on one of the extremes, even though it's not your quote unquote fault, you're the product of your environment, everything that happened before you, generational trauma, all these different things, it informs who you are, and how your brain works and the actions that you take. And so it seems that the criminal justice system should take that into account when deciding punishment or deciding how to enforce laws and these sorts of things. Now, there's no, as I said before, there's no excuse for political violence. Crimes are
Yeah, we're not
crimes.
saying that.
Society has to deal with that. But the reason why people do things, it's informed by their life experience about their environments. All these other things that we might not fully appreciate because we don't live their lives. We've been blessed with a much smoother, or for the most part, many of us are blessed with a smoother life. So it's hard for us to imagine that. It's hard for us to put ourselves in that person's shoes and understand the reality that they have to live in.
So yeah, I'm glad that you said that because I'm compared to myself because you said earlier people can have compassion for me, right? That because of what they see that I went through and things like that. It's easy to see. I actually have compassion for people who don't go through this kind of experience that I went through because it was so extreme that it was actually like it was so extreme and this brain was so non-functioning in terms of being able to survive in society. In order to survive, I had to go in a more spiritual direction in order to survive. I actually have a lot of compassion in which the mental health doesn't seem to be that extreme because it's, now it's like a little bit ambiguous and where to go with it. So my point that I want to make though is this is now at the age in my 50s and I look back on the way I was and all, I could see how my personality, the decisions that I made and the way my ego was based on the generations before me, the brain that I inherited, how I was raised, and the society that I grew up in, right? And therefore, a choice was made continually in which I lost my marriage. And so there was a tragedy that happened here that caused me to change. That I can look back on it now, and that can inform me moving forward with my daughter and other relationships. I could look back on it. I don't want that anymore. I don't want to be that way anymore. And I could have been more sensitive to people, and I just, and I don't want that anymore. I survived my tragedy that of it creating an ego, that ego being created like that to get to the point where I lost my marriage. I survived it, made the changes, and can look back on it and realize what happened, have compassion for myself. Look at that young man and the tragic decisions that he made. Now,
Mm.
imagine
Yeah.
him at the age of 50, looking back, an act that was done, that a 22-year-old young man was done, influenced by all this, and what's going to happen to him now. And this can go either way. This is not a political discussion. This can go either way. You know, so the tragic decision that I made was survivable, and I can look back. That one, there's going to be so many things that's going to happen to that person now. It's going to be really hard to,
Yeah.
to possibly, but like I said, though, under great duress and stress, sometimes the ego has spontaneously dropped and a spiritual life was created spontaneously from the kind of stress. That's happened too.
Yeah. I think in many ways, even though what you went through was very difficult, I think you're fortunate to have come to that realization through that process. I think to myself, if people would be able to have this kind of realization earlier in their lives, they could live many more years in a smoother, happier way if they could have that understanding earlier. And it's very difficult because sometimes you just have to live through things, really experience them. You were in a situation where you engaged in meditation, maybe self-reflection, introspection, and really came to this understanding. But a lot of people, you don't have that opportunity.
Yeah,
A
I
lot of
do
people are
feel,
living their
yeah,
entire lives suffering.
yeah, as I said, the abusive childhood, the trauma, the generational trauma, the mental health conditions. I actually feel lucky because I had a strong spiritual experience occurred here 5 years before my wife said I wanted a divorce. And if I didn't have that, and all I thought was just this reality and surviving in it, I don't know if I would have survived. It was because I was blessed with a deeper spiritual understanding of myself 5 years earlier that I decided to pursue that direction stuff.
Yeah.
And when you say, if people had this understanding, I think the majority of society would be moving towards a smoother, more peaceful life when we start understanding that and teaching our children this, when we not teaching more to show children, starting with their own families, that as a society, what we prioritize more than anything else, even over surviving the economic system, is being aware of and sensitive to the way this human species is and being sensitive to it. Because when you don't pay attention to how it's designed, especially how it's designed to survive, now its greatest strength has turned into a weakness because it's being overdone. Because it's not that you weren't aware of it and didn't understand it, you weren't sensitive to it and you weren't prioritizing it.
Yeah. And so that's a lot of what you do, in your practice, the book that you wrote, this channel. You're trying to expose these ideas, develop a community of people who, are interested in understanding better these sorts of things, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's more to kickstart that kind of path through the meditations that I do, because that is, I feel that it takes a long time to read about stuff like this and to know it intellectually, and then there's a shift of an identity there. For some people, it can take decades, before this, like here. And so, however, if there's a way in which this identity shift that you are not the way this body thinks, acts, and behaves, and then you have this kind of shift toward a greater understanding of who you really are, your relation to God and the universe, then you can more objectively look at this body and the human species as a whole and the way it was designed and understand it objectively without identifying with it so much. And so the meditations here are designed to kickstart that sooner, like to kickstart like the dissolving of all the unresolved core emotions, trauma energies, and an ego, so it can just be much calmer, more peaceful, softer. And then so when it starts to look at itself and traumas that it went through and the way it was designed, mental health, it doesn't take it so personally, and therefore then we can that from that individual, they can then look at society as a whole and see the whole thing happening there. And so, what if more people had this viewpoint of we have to understand ourselves from a species level, not take it personally, understand how the survival mechanism works biologically over generations, and be sensitive to it and make it the top priority, or else you're going to get what you're going to get. So everything that's happening here actually makes sense. But this does seem to be the human history, isn't it? We peak, get to a point where we're doing wars. Oh, that we took it too far, goes down, and then we keep on separating again, keep on like basing our priority on surviving in society until something happens. Terrible war happens. Oh, we went too far again, then it goes down. That seems to be the cycle of human history.
Yeah. I was going to say that I think it's very difficult for people when you're thinking about your own life to separate out those things, your emotions, your feelings, that sort of thing. But if someone's looking at your life, they think, oh, like there's a separation from that. I don't identify with your life, your marriage, your daughter, your career, whatever it is. And therefore, when you tell the story, now, okay, I can better understand it because I'm not bringing my own emotional baggage in that situation. Whereas if I'm thinking about my own life, I'll justify the actions I took. I'll justify the way I think. There's a whole mental story that my ego is creating to rationalize, justify, explain my situation. But when you look at someone else, you might be able to look at it from a more detached perspective and try to understand, oh, there are more factors that go into the way you are, why you do certain things, why you act a certain way. And so if we were able to bring that same level of detachment to our own lives, to take a step back, when something happens and we feel, triggered, we have an emotional response. That is the essence of meditation is take a step back, look at that situation and don't react, in the moment. It's like, okay, why am I feeling this way? Why am I getting, angry, annoyed, whatever the emotion might be. And then you might realize, okay, there's something else going on there. And then over a period of time with that exploration, you might realize that your brain is filtering this information. It's creating a story. It is, it's driven to a certain action because of these emotions.
Yeah. And I would also say do all that and resolve the unresolved core emotions, traumas that happened to you. Because, a defensive person or ego usually is that which has experienced that has unresolved core emotions and has experienced trauma. It'll cause the creation of that person, that ego, to be much more tight and to itself and believing that it's separate. And so for people like that, because I hear this a lot, like I work with people in the addiction field, and the person who's the addict, one of the reasons why they have a hard time getting into engaging in recovery is even when they hear stories of other addicts, they'll say something like, "Well, that's not me." You know, I didn't live that kind of life. So, well, you're both addicts. Yeah, but I'm not that person. So it'll create an ego that's, not resolving these emotions, living under the stress will create an ego that's now defensive unto itself and will not be able to see, like, don't you see that there are similarities? No, I don't see any similarities. That's not me. And it'll be so uptight. So what we have to do is don't help people to see based on this story. I would say to that person who's uptight like that, well, you understand though that that person, even though they have a different story than you, they were feeling scared. They were feeling depressed. They were feeling angry. Have you ever felt those things before? Well, yeah, that's what they were reacting to. How they got there with the story now is immaterial. It's really actually all about your feelings. Do you
Mm.
understand fear? Do you understand depression? Do you understand anger? Yes, I understand that. That's what you need to relate to. So that young man, I could say I'm not that person totally, but do I understand, you know, emotionally, uh, what can happen to a person when they're put through certain kinds of ways of being raised in society and born with certain, a certain kind of brain and on the emotions that it can create? Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah. I think that's maybe a good place to end on. Do you have any final thoughts you want to share? Any other things you want to respond to?
I mean, it's just like, again, I was going to say it again, like, don't depend upon somebody else to start changing all of this stuff. We got to depend upon our lawmakers to start with your, like you said, start with yourself, start with your family, and then move out from there. Because, if you're depending upon lawmakers to change all this situation, but you're coming home to a family in which you're not getting along and you're not taking the time to prioritize and be sensitive to each other, what's the use of a government doing something? It's still going to cause you, your personal strife at home will still exist. 'Cause, so start with your individual and then move to the people in your, closest to you in your intimate circle and then go from there and stuff is what I would say. And when I say start with it, start having understanding, compassion, and awareness and sensitivity to yourself and be brutally honest with whatever kinds of unresolved core or trauma emotions that you have back there. Like they say in the 12 steps, you're only as sick as your secrets. So whatever you don't share and you become reclusive, it just festers. And so, learn to look at that and heal from that by getting the help that you need if you have those kinds of issues.
All right, very good. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay. Thank you very much. And until then, have a great week. Thank you, everyone.